The rain fell in heavy sheets across the university campus, turning the autumn evening into a blur of gray shadows and flickering streetlights. Marcus Chen pulled his jacket tighter. As he hurried toward his dormitory, books clutched against his chest, already dreading another night of struggling with his advanced propulsion systems assignment. The engineering program at Terra Nova University was notorious for breaking students, and Marcus was beginning to understand why. He almost missed her entirely. A small figure sat hunched on the steps of the International Student Housing Complex, completely motionless despite the downpour soaking through her clothes. At first glance, Marcus thought it might be a discarded mannequin or some kind of art installation. The posture was too still, too perfectly dejected to be real. But as he drew closer, squinting through the rain, he realized it was a person. A young woman, by the looks of it, with an unusual silhouette that made him pause. Her skin held a subtle blue-green tint that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light, and her hair cascaded down her back in waves that looked almost like flowing water. When she turned slightly at the sound of his approaching footsteps, Marcus caught a glimpse of large, dark eyes that reflected the streetlight like polished obsidian. She was clearly not human, though she possessed a delicate beauty that made his breath catch. This had to be one of the exchange students from the outer colonies, the first group to arrive at Terra Nova in over a decade. Marcus had heard whispers about them in the halls, though most of the talk had been less than welcoming. Apparently, the university's diversity initiative wasn't sitting well with everyone. "Hey," Marcus called out softly, stepping closer despite the rain now thoroughly soaking his own clothes. "Are you okay?" The young woman looked up at him with startled eyes, as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice her, let alone speak to her. For a moment, she just stared, water droplets clinging to her unusual features like tiny diamonds. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a melodic quality that seemed to harmonize with the sound of the falling rain. "I'm fine," she said, though everything about her posture suggested otherwise. "Just enjoying the weather." Marcus glanced around the empty courtyard, noting how other students had given this area a wide berth despite it being the main path to the dormitories. Even now, he could see a few figures hurrying past on the far side of the quad, deliberately avoiding this section of campus. The pieces clicked together in his mind. She wasn't just sitting here by choice. "You're one of the exchange students," he said, settling down on the steps beside her despite the puddle that immediately soaked through his jeans. "From the Zephyr system, right?" She nodded slowly, surprise flickering across her features. "Zara Velenith," she said, extending a hand that trembled slightly, whether from cold or something else. Marcus couldn't tell. "And you're the first person to ask my name since I arrived 3 weeks ago." Marcus felt his stomach drop. 3 weeks of sitting alone, avoided by an entire campus population. He'd known some students were uncomfortable with the new diversity policies, but this level of isolation seemed cruel beyond belief. "Marcus," he said, taking her offered hand. Her skin was surprising, warm despite the cold rain, with a texture that reminded him of smooth river stones. "Marcus Chen, I'm in the engineering program." "Engineering," Zara repeated, and for the first time, something like interest sparked in her dark eyes. "I was supposed to be studying comparative technologies," but she gestured vaguely toward the dormitory behind them. "My assigned housing partners requested a transfer the day after I moved in. Apparently, my presence made them uncomfortable." The way she said the word, with careful pronunciation and barely concealed hurt, made Marcus's jaw clench. He'd experienced his share of discrimination. Being one of the few students from the lower-tier colony worlds meant he understood what it felt like to be an outsider. But this was something else entirely. "Where are you staying now?" he asked. Zara was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain create small rivers in the concrete. At their feet, the international office provided a temporary room in the basement of the administrative building. "It's not really designed for long-term habitation. No windows, no proper ventilation. But it's shelter." Marcus made a decision that would have surprised him if he'd stopped to think about it. Standing up, he extended his hand to her again, this time as an invitation rather than a greeting. "Come on," he said. "I've got a small apartment about 6 blocks from here, It's not much, but it's warm and dry. And I was just about to make dinner. You look like you could use both." Zara stared at his outstretched hand as if it were an alien artifact. She couldn't quite comprehend. Why would you?" "Because no one should have to sit alone in the rain," Marcus said simply. "And because I have a feeling you might be able to help me understand this impossible engineering assignment that's been making my life hell for the past 2 weeks." For the first time since he'd approached her, Zara smiled. It was a small expression, tentative and fragile, but it transformed her entire face. The combination of her unusual features and that hint of genuine warmth created something breathtaking. "You don't even know me," she said. But she was already reaching for his hand. "Then I guess we'll fix that over dinner," Marcus replied, helping her to her feet. As they walked through the rain-soaked streets toward his apartment, Marcus couldn't help but notice how Zara seemed to relax with each step away from the campus. Her posture straightened, her breathing became less shallow, and she even began to look around with curiosity rather than wariness. Whatever her people were like, she clearly had the same appreciation for small kindnesses that he did. His apartment was nothing special, a studio unit in a converted warehouse that catered to students who couldn't afford the nicer housing near campus. But it was his space, filled with his projects and books and the accumulated debris of someone pursuing an impossible degree while working 2 part-time jobs to afford it. "It's not much," he said, unlocking the door and stepping aside to let her enter first. Zara stepped inside and immediately moved toward the small kitchenette area. Drawn by the warm light spilling from the overhead fixture, she turned in a slow circle, taking in the organized chaos of his living space, the drafting table covered in half-finished schematics, the bookshelf stuffed with technical manuals and a few precious novels, the single window that looked out over the city's industrial district. "It's perfect," she said, and the wonder in her voice made Marcus realize that maybe, just maybe, he'd done something right for once. As he moved to prepare their simple dinner, nothing fancy, just heated soup and sandwiches, Marcus found himself watching Zara explore his small domain with the careful movements of someone who hadn't felt safe in a very long time. She touched things gently, as if afraid they might disappear, and when she finally settled onto his second-hand couch, she curled up in a way that suggested she was trying to take up as little space as possible. "So," Marcus said, ladling soup into mismatched bowls, "tell me about this comparative technologies program. What exactly were you supposed to be comparing? And for the first time in 3 weeks, Zara Veleneth began to talk. The steam from the soup bowl curled upward like tiny spirits in the warm light of Marcus's apartment, and for the first time since arriving on Earth, Zara felt something approaching peace. She wrapped her fingers around the ceramic, letting the heat seep into her skin, a comfort her people had always drawn from warmth and moisture. "Comparative technologies," she repeated Marcus's question, her voice steadier now that she was out of the rain and away from the hostile stares. "My people, the Zephyrians, we've developed along different paths than humans. Where you focus on mechanical solutions, we've learned to work with organic systems. Living machines, you might say." Marcus paused in his soup preparation, genuine interest replacing the polite concern he'd shown earlier. "Living machines? Like biological computers, something like that." Zara's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "The university recruited me specifically because our biotechnology could help solve some of Earth's energy crisis. Clean, renewable, self-repairing systems." Her expression darkened. "At least, that was the plan." Marcus settled into the chair across from her, his own bowl steaming between his hands. "What happened?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than the warm humidity rising from their dinner. Zara studied Marcus's face, searching for any sign of the judgment or disgust she'd grown accustomed to seeing. Instead, she found only patient curiosity and something that looked remarkably like genuine concern. "The Hendersons," she said finally. "They were my sponsor family. The university arranged for me to live with them for my first semester, to help with cultural integration." She took a sip of soup, buying herself time. "Professor Henderson teaches xenobiology. His wife runs the International Student Services Department. On paper, They were perfect. Marcus waited, not pushing, and Zara found herself grateful for his patience. Most humans seem to expect immediate answers, complete explanations delivered in neat packages. Marcus understood the value of silence. The first week was acceptable, she continued. They showed me around the city, helped me understand local customs, taught me about human social hierarchies. But then I made the mistake of showing them what I could do. She set down her spoon and extended her hand, palm up. Marcus watched, fascinated, as her skin began to shimmer with a faint bioluminescence. The light pulsed gently, like a slow heartbeat, casting dancing shadows on the apartment walls. We don't just study living machines, Zara explained. We are living machines in a sense. Our bodies can interface directly with biological systems, encourage growth, facilitate healing. It's how we've survived on a world where technology and nature had to merge or die. The light faded, and Marcus reached forward instinctively, stopping just short of touching her hand. That's incredible, he breathed. The applications for medical technology alone, that's what the Hendersons thought. Too, Zara's voice turned bitter. They started inviting colleagues over for dinner. Demonstrations, they called them. Show us how you make plants grow faster, Zara. Can you heal this cut, Zara? What about making this bacteria culture multiply? Always just one more test, one more proof of concept. Marcus's expression shifted, understanding dawning in his eyes. They were using you. I was naive enough to think they were just curious, enthusiastic about my abilities. Zara pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller, until I overheard Professor Henderson on a call with someone from the biotech division. He was discussing patent applications, ways to extract and synthesize my biological capabilities. The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples of outrage that Marcus couldn't hide. His hands clenched around his soup bowl, knuckles whitening. They wanted to turn you into a laboratory subject, he said, his voice low and angry when I confronted them about it. They acted like I was being unreasonable. Professor Henderson explained that this was how real scientific progress happened, that I should be honored to contribute to human advancement. Zara's laugh held no humor. Mrs. Henderson suggested I was being paranoid, that perhaps I wasn't mature enough for a program like this. So you left. I tried to. The next morning, I packed my things and went to the international office to request new housing. That's when I discovered they'd already filed a report about my unstable behavior and difficulty adapting to human social norms. The university put a hold on my housing transfer pending a psychological evaluation. Marcus set down his bowl with more force than necessary, soup sloshing over the rim. They sabotaged you. The evaluation was humiliating. Zara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Dr. Whitmore, the staff psychologist, spent 2 hours asking me questions about my aggressive tendencies and paranoid delusions. When I tried to explain what the Hendersons had done, she nodded sympathetically and made notes about my persecution. Complex, the apartment fell silent except for the gentle patter of rain against the window. Marcus stared at Zara, trying to process the systematic cruelty she'd described. No wonder she'd been sitting alone in the rain. She'd been effectively exiled from the very support systems meant to help her. The basement room, he said. That was their solution. Temporary housing while they assess my suitability for the program. Zara unwrapped herself slightly, reaching for her soup again. I think they're hoping I'll give up and go home, save them the trouble of officially expelling me. Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window where he stared out at the rain-soaked city. This is insane. You came here to help, to share knowledge that could benefit everyone, and they're treating you like a criminal. It's not entirely their fault, Zara said quietly. My people, we're not easy for humans to understand. We're different in ways that make some of you uncomfortable. Our appearance, our abilities, the way we think about the relationship between technology and biology. Different doesn't mean wrong, Marcus said fiercely, turning back to face her. And it definitely doesn't mean you deserve to be exploited or isolated. For a moment, Zara just stared at him, as if his words were in a language she was still learning to translate. Then, slowly, tears began to gather in her dark eyes, not the desperate sobs of someone breaking down. but the quiet overflow of someone who hadn't realized how much they needed to hear exactly those words. On Zephyr, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We have a saying, water finds water. It means that those who understand the flow of life will always find each other, even in the driest places. Marcus moved back to the couch, sitting closer this time, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I don't know much about the flow of life, he said, but I know what it's like to feel like you don't belong anywhere, and I know that what happened to you isn't right. Zara looked at him through her tears, seeing something in his expression that she'd begun to think didn't exist among humans. Unconditional acceptance, not tolerance, not curiosity, but genuine acceptance of who and what she was. Why, she whispered, why are you being kind to me when everyone else? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. My sister, he said finally. She was born with a genetic condition that made her look different, not dramatically, just enough that other kids noticed, enough that adults stared and whispered. His voice grew soft with memory. She used to ask me the same question, why people were cruel to her, when she'd never done anything to hurt them. I never had a good answer then, and I don't have one now, but I know what loneliness looks like, and I know it's not something anyone should have to carry alone. Zara reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against his hand. The contact sent a small warmth through both of them, a recognition that transcended species barriers. Your sister, she said, is she? She died when I was 16. The condition affected more than just her appearance. Marcus's fingers intertwined with Zara's, accepting the comfort she offered. But she taught me something important before she left. She taught me that kindness costs nothing, but its absence can cost everything. They sat together in the warm light of the apartment, rain drumming against the windows. To outsiders who had found something rare and precious in each other's company. Neither of them spoke for a long time, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of recognition, of the beginning of something that neither of them had expected to find outside. The storm continued, but inside Marcus's small apartment, two lonely souls had discovered they didn't have to weather it alone. 3 days had passed since that first rain-soaked evening, and Marcus found himself looking forward to coming home from classes in a way he never had before. Zara had quietly integrated herself into his daily routine. She was always there when he returned, usually curled up on his couch with one of his engineering textbooks, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked through concepts that had been giving him nightmares for weeks. Today was no different, except for the fact that his Advanced Propulsion Systems project was due tomorrow, and he was no closer to a solution than he'd been a month ago. The assignment was supposedly simple: design a theoretical engine system that could achieve sustainable faster-than-light travel without requiring exotic matter or violating known physics. In practice, it was an exercise in creative impossibility that had already claimed 3 students who'd dropped the course in frustration. You look like someone who's about to face execution, Zara observed from the couch as Marcus trudged through the door, his backpack laden with textbooks and printed research papers. Worse, Marcus groaned, dropping into his desk chair and pulling out the half-finished schematics that represented weeks of failed attempts. Professor Nakamura's propulsion project. I'm starting to think he assigned it just to watch us suffer. Zara unfolded herself from the couch with that fluid grace that had begun to seem natural, moving to peer over his shoulder at the scattered papers. Marcus was acutely aware of her proximity. The way her unusual scent, something like ozone and flowering vines, seemed to clear his head and scramble his thoughts simultaneously. Faster than light travel, she read from his project description. Interesting challenge, impossible challenge, Marcus corrected. Every approach I've tried runs into the same problems. Energy requirements that would drain a star, materials that don't exist, or fundamental violations of causality. Zara was quiet for a moment, studying his calculations with an intensity that made Marcus wonder what she was seeing that he'd missed. Her dark eyes moved across the equations with a familiarity that seemed almost unnatural for someone supposedly learning human technology. May I? She asked, gesturing toward his drafting tablet. Marcus handed it over, expecting her to ask questions about his notation or mathematical conventions. Instead, she began sketching with confident strokes, her hand moving across the surface as if she were drawing from memory rather than imagination. "Your approach assumes that space is something you have to push through," she said, not looking up from her work. "But what if space is something you can convince to help you?" "Convince?" Marcus leaned closer, watching geometric shapes flow from her stylus. "Space isn't alive, Zara. It doesn't have opinions, doesn't it?" She glanced up at him, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "On Zephyr, we've learned that the line between living and non-living isn't as clear as most species believe. Spacetime has properties, responds to influence, changes based on what moves through it. That sounds remarkably like a living system to me." The shape taking form on the screen was unlike anything Marcus had seen in his textbooks. It wasn't mechanical in the traditional sense. No obvious engines or fuel systems, no brute force approach to the problem of interstellar travel. Instead, it looked almost organic, with flowing curves and what appeared to be some kind of circulatory system running through its structure. "This is beautiful," Marcus said, genuinely awed by the elegance of her design, "but I don't understand how it's supposed to work." Zara's fingers danced across the tablet, adding layers of detail that revealed the genius hidden in the seemingly simple curves. "Think of it as a symbiotic relationship. Instead of forcing your way through spacetime, you create a biological interface that can communicate with the quantum substrate, request passage rather than demanding it." Biological interface. Marcus studied the new details she'd added, recognizing what looked like neural pathways and something resembling septic connections. "You're talking about a living ship. Not just living, thinking, feeling, a vessel that can sense the currents in spacetime and ride them instead of fighting them." Zara's excitement was infectious, her voice gaining energy as she explained concepts that clearly fascinated her. "Your human physics focuses on force and resistance. Zephyrian science focuses on harmony and cooperation." Marcus stared at the design, his mind racing as he began to understand the implications. The energy requirements. Minimal when you work with natural forces instead of against them. You need much less power to achieve the same results. Zara added a series of equations that made Marcus's head spin. Mathematics that seemed to incorporate variables he'd never encountered. Relationships between space and time and consciousness that challenged everything he thought he knew about. "Physics, this is impossible," he breathed, but even as he said it, he could see how the pieces fit together. This level of biotechnology, this understanding of spacetime mechanics. Humans are centuries away from anything like this. Zara went very still, her stylus frozen above the tablet. For a moment, Marcus thought he'd said something wrong, that he'd somehow offended her. Then he saw the expression on her face, not hurt, but fear, the same careful, guarded look she'd worn when they first met. "Zara," he said gently, "how do you know all this?" She set down the stylus and moved away from the desk, wrapping her arms around herself in that self-protective gesture he'd seen too often. "I told you, I'm here to study comparative technologies." "No." Marcus stood, following her to the center of the room. "This isn't studying. This is like asking Leonardo da Vinci to compare his helicopter designs to modern aircraft. You're not learning our technology. You're teaching me yours." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither of them wanted to voice. Finally, Zara sank onto the couch, looking smaller and more vulnerable than she had since that first night in the rain. "My people," she said quietly, "we've been traveling between stars for over 1,000 of your years. The technology I just showed you, it's standard curriculum for children on Zephyr." Marcus felt the world shift around him, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with almost audible finality. "You're not an exchange student. I am, technically, just not the kind you assumed." Zara looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting a pain that went deeper than academic disappointment. "I'm what you might call an advanced scout, part of a program to assess whether Earth is ready for formal contact with the Galactic Cooperative." The words hung in the air, like a challenge to everything Marcus thought he understood about his place in the universe. Humans had always assumed They were alone, or at least that any alien contact would be obvious, dramatic, announced with fanfare and formal delegations. How many others? He asked. A dozen, scattered across different universities and research institutions on Earth. We're supposed to integrate quietly, assess human technological and social development, report back on whether your species is ready to join the broader galactic community. Marcus slumped into his desk chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd just revealed. And your assessment? So far, Zara's laugh was bitter. The Hendersons wanted to dissect me for patents. The university administration thinks I'm mentally unstable. Most students won't even acknowledge my existence. She gestured toward the tablet with its impossible designs. I'm beginning to think the assessment isn't going to be favorable. But that's not fair, Marcus protested. You can't judge our entire species based on a few narrow-minded academics, can't I? Zara's voice held a sadness that seemed to encompass worlds. Marcus, in the 3 weeks before I met you, not a single human had shown me genuine kindness. Not one person had looked at me and seen someone worth knowing rather than something to be used or avoided. The weight of that statement settled over Marcus like a physical burden. He thought about his own assumptions, his own prejudices, the way he'd initially been more curious about her technology than her feelings. How many others like Zara were out there, forming opinions about humanity based on humanity's worst impulses? What happens now? He asked. Now Zara looked at the tablet, at the revolutionary design that could change everything humans thought they knew about space. Travel. Now I finish my assessment and report back to the cooperative. They'll decide whether Earth gets invited to join the galactic community or whether you need another few centuries to mature as a species. Marcus stood and moved to sit beside her on the couch, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to crowd her. And what's your assessment going to say? Zara was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if memorizing it. 3 days ago, I would have recommended isolation for at least another 100 years. Humans seem to focus on exploitation, too quick to fear what they don't understand. And now I've met someone who brought a stranger in from the rain, who listened to her story without judgment, who looked at impossible technology and saw wonder instead of profit. Zara's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with an ease that felt like coming home. Now I'm not sure what to recommend. Marcus squeezed her hand gently, feeling the warmth of her unusual skin, the slight texture that marked her as something other than human. Maybe, he said, your assessment doesn't have to be about all of humanity. Maybe it can be about potential, about what we could become. And what do you think humans could become? Zara asked. Marcus looked at their joined hands, at the revolutionary designs on his tablet, at this incredible woman who had trusted him with secrets that could reshape the world. Something better, he said. Given the right teachers, the morning arrived gray and unforgiving, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything look washed out and weary. Marcus had barely slept, his mind churning through the implications of everything Zara had revealed. She was still curled on his couch where she'd fallen asleep after their conversation, looking peaceful in a way that made his chest tighten with protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed. The sharp knock on his door shattered the quiet like breaking glass. Marcus glanced at Zara, who was already awake and alert with the instant awareness of someone accustomed to danger. Her dark eyes met his, and he saw the same dread reflected there that was currently clawing at his stomach. Stay here, he whispered, moving toward the door. Through the peephole, he could see two figures in university administration blazers flanked by campus security. His blood ran cold when he recognized one of them, Mrs. Henderson, Zara's former sponsor, looking grimly determined. Mr. Chen, came the authoritative voice from the hallway. This is Dean Morrison from Student Services. We need to speak with you about Zara Veleneth. Marcus glanced back at Zara, who had wrapped herself in the blanket like armor. Her expression held a resignation that broke his heart. She'd been expecting this. Just a minute, Marcus called, buying time he didn't know how to use. In a few seconds, he would have to open that door and watch them take away the most extraordinary person he'd ever met. Don't, Zara said softly. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Like hell, Marcus muttered. then raised his voice. "What's this regarding?" "Ms. Velleneth missed her mandatory counseling session yesterday," came Dean Morrison's reply. "Dr. Whitmore has recommended immediate intervention. We're here to escort her back to appropriate housing." Marcus felt anger rise in his throat like bile. Appropriate housing. They meant the basement cell where they'd been keeping her isolated and miserable. She's not a prisoner. He called through the door. "Mr. Chen, please open the door. Ms. Velleneth is not well, and she needs professional help. We're only trying to do what's best for her." The condescension in the dean's voice made Marcus's hands clench into fists. He looked at Zara, expecting to see defeat in her posture, but instead found something else entirely. She had straightened, the blanket falling away, and there was a steel in her expression that reminded him she wasn't just some helpless victim. She was a representative of a civilization that had mastered interstellar travel. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying new authority, "open the door." He hesitated, but something in her tone convinced him when the door swung open. The delegation in the hallway found themselves facing not a cowering refugee, but Zara Velleneth standing tall and dignified, with Marcus flanking her like a chosen ally rather than a reluctant host. Dean Morrison was a thin, sharp-featured man with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Mrs. Henderson stood beside him, her expression carefully neutral, but her body language radiating smugness. The two security guards looked uncomfortable, as if they'd rather be anywhere else. "Ms. Velleneth," the dean said, his tone dripping with false concern, "you've been causing quite a stir. Dr. Whitmore is very worried about your mental state." "Dr. Whitmore," Zara replied with perfect politeness, "is concerned about things that are none of her business." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her mask of concern slipping slightly. "Zara, dear, you're clearly not thinking rationally. Living in this accommodation with Mr. Chen is hardly appropriate for someone in your condition." "My condition," Zara's voice remained level, but Marcus could see the dangerous light in her eyes. "And what condition would that be, exactly?" "You're obviously suffering from acute adjustment disorder," Dean Morrison interjected smoothly. "It's not uncommon among international students, especially those from more isolated cultures. The important thing is getting you back into a controlled environment where we can monitor your progress." Marcus felt his temper snap. "Controlled environment? You mean that basement cell you've been keeping her in? That's not medical treatment, it's punishment." "Mr. Chen," Mrs. Henderson said coldly, "you're not qualified to assess Ms. Velleneth's needs. This young woman requires specialized care that only trained professionals can provide." "Professionals like you," Marcus shot back. "The same professionals who tried to file patents on her biology?" The hallway went dead silent. Dean Morrison's smile faltered, and Mrs. Henderson's face flushed with anger. Even the security guards straightened, suddenly paying much closer attention to the conversation. "I don't know what lies she's told you," Mrs. Henderson said tightly, "but Ms. Velleneth has a documented history of paranoid delusions and aggressive behavior toward her caregivers." "Documented by whom?" Zara asked with quiet intensity. "By the woman standing next to you. The same woman who invited colleagues to dinner, specifically to watch me perform like a trained animal." Dean Morrison cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "Regardless of any misunderstandings about your previous housing arrangement, the fact remains that you're currently in violation of your student visa requirements. You're required to live in university-approved housing and attend all mandatory counseling sessions." "And if I refuse?" Zara asked. "Then we'll have no choice but to recommend termination of your exchange status and immediate deportation." The dean replied with the satisfaction of someone playing a winning card. Marcus felt the world tilt around him. They would send her away, back to whatever distant world she'd come from, and he would never see her again. Worse, they would send her back convinced that humans were exactly as small-minded and cruel as she'd initially believed. "Wait," he said, stepping forward. "What if there was another option?" Dean Morrison raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Marcus took a deep breath, knowing he was about to gamble everything on a desperate play. "What if Ms. Velleneth transferred her housing authorization to me as her academic partner?" "Academic partner?" Mrs. Henderson's voice dripped skepticism. "We've been collaborating on my propulsion systems project," Marcus said, the light coming surprisingly easily. "Her unique perspective on comparative technologies has been invaluable. If she's listed as my research partner, that should satisfy the visa requirements without forcing her back into an unsuitable living situation." Zara stared at him in amazement, and he could see her quick mind working through the implications of what he was proposing. It wasn't just about housing. He was offering to tie his own academic future to hers, creating a partnership that would make it much harder for the university to isolate or mistreat her. "That's highly irregular," Dean Morrison said slowly. "But not impossible," Marcus pressed. "Professor Nakamura allows advanced students to form research partnerships if he signs off on it, and if Ms. Veleneth's academic performance meets standards. There's no reason she couldn't complete her exchange under those terms." The dean and Mrs. Henderson exchanged glances, clearly not pleased with this development, but unable to find an immediate objection. Finally, Dean Morrison nodded grudgingly. "Very well. But there will be conditions: monthly progress reviews, mandatory check-ins with Dr. Whitmore, and any sign of instability or academic failure will result in immediate termination of the arrangement." "Agreed," Marcus said quickly, before anyone could change their minds. "Ms. Veleneth," the dean asked, "do you consent to these terms?" Zara looked at Marcus for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to the delegation with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected worlds. "I consent," she said formally, "with one addition, which is, I want it noted in my official record that Mr. Chen initiated this arrangement entirely of his own volition, without coercion or influence from me. Whatever happens moving forward, the responsibility is his alone." Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. "Why would that matter?" Zara's smile was sharp as winter starlight. "Because when this partnership succeeds beyond your wildest expectations, I want there to be no question about who deserves the credit." After the delegation left, with grudging agreements to process the paperwork and sullen promises to monitor the situation closely, Marcus and Zara stood in his doorway watching them disappear down the hall. The silence that followed felt different from their previous quiet moments, charged with possibility and weighted with the knowledge that they had just changed everything. "You didn't have to do that," Zara said softly. "Yes, I did," Marcus replied. "You said your assessment of humanity was based on how we treat those who are different, those who need help. Well, this is my assessment. This is what I think we can become." Zara turned to face him fully, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "And if they're right? If I really am unstable, unsuitable, impossible to work with?" Marcus reached for her hands, intertwining their fingers with growing familiarity. "Then we'll be unstable together. Besides," he added with a grin, "I've seen what you can do with impossible engineering problems. I think we're going to be just fine." For the first time since he'd known her, Zara laughed, not the bitter, hollow sound he'd heard before, but something genuine and bright and full of hope. "Marcus Chen," she said, "I think you might just save both our worlds." 6 months later, the university's annual research symposium buzzed with an energy that felt electric. Marcus stood beside their presentation display, adjusting his tie for the 20th time while watching a steady stream of professors, graduate students, and industry representatives examine their work with expressions ranging from amazement to outright disbelief. "Stop fidgeting," Zara murmured beside him, though her own posture betrayed a nervous tension. She looked radiant in the formal dress she'd chosen for the occasion, a deep blue that complemented her natural coloring and made her seem to glow under the conference lighting. "They're going to think we're frauds if you keep acting like we've done something impossible." "We have done something impossible," Marcus whispered back, gesturing toward the holographic display showing their completed propulsion system design. 3 months ago, Professor Nakamura called this project an exercise in creative futility. Now we've got representatives from the European Space Agency asking if we can have a working prototype ready for testing. Their research partnership had exceeded everyone's expectations, including their own. What had started as a desperate gambit to keep Zara from being deported had evolved into something extraordinary. The synthesis of human engineering principles with Zephyrian biotechnology had produced innovations that neither species had achieved alone. The living ship design they'd presented wasn't just theoretical anymore. It was a fully realized system, with working subsystems they'd built and tested in the university's advanced fabrication lab. The biological computers could process navigation calculations faster than any silicon-based system. The organic hull materials could self-repair and adapt to different space environments. Most remarkably, the consciousness interface allowed for a symbiotic relationship between pilot and vessel that made faster-than-light travel not just possible, but elegant. Dr. Chen, Ms. Villeneuve, they turned to see Professor Nakamura approaching with a man Marcus didn't recognize, tall, distinguished, with the kind of bearing that suggested importance. "I'd like you to meet Director Walsh from the International Space Development Council," Nakamura said, barely able to contain his excitement. "He's very interested in discussing funding for full-scale development of your propulsion system." Director Walsh extended his hand with a smile that seemed genuine. "I have to admit, when Professor Nakamura first sent me your preliminary designs, I thought someone was playing an elaborate prank. Biological starship technology seemed like something out of science fiction." "Sometimes fiction points the way toward truth," Zara replied diplomatically, accepting his handshake. "Indeed, and your background in comparative technologies has certainly brought a unique perspective to the field." Walsh's eyes held a sharpness that made Marcus wonder exactly how much the director knew about Zara's true origins. "I understand you're from one of the outer colonies, something like that," Zara said smoothly. "Well, regardless of where these ideas originated, the applications are staggering. Clean energy, sustainable space travel, medical technologies that could revolutionize healing." Walsh paused, studying their display with the focused attention of someone calculating enormous sums. "The council would be very interested in establishing a dedicated research facility. Full funding, unlimited resources, your own team of researchers." Marcus felt Zara tense beside him. The offer was everything any young scientist could dream of: recognition, resources, the chance to change the world. But he could see the conflict in her expression, the weight of responsibilities that had nothing to do with academic success. "That's incredibly generous," Marcus said carefully, "but we'd need some time to consider the implications." Of course, these decisions shouldn't be rushed." Walsh handed them each a business card with contact information embossed in gold. "But don't wait too long. Opportunities like this have a way of evolving quickly in the current political climate." After Walsh moved on to examine other projects, Marcus and Zara found themselves alone beside their display for the first time in hours. The symposium was winding down, the crowds thinning as evening approached. "You're thinking about your report," Marcus said quietly. Zara nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of their research summary. "The assessment period ends next week. I have to submit my recommendations to the cooperative." They'd talked about this moment for months, but somehow Marcus had managed to convince himself it was still far in the future. The idea that Zara might leave, that she might return to the stars and leave him behind with nothing but memories and revolutionary technology, felt like a physical ache in his chest. "What are you going to tell them?" he asked. "I don't know." Zara's voice held a vulnerability that reminded him of that first night in the rain. 6 months ago, the answer seemed obvious. Humanity wasn't ready for galactic contact, too focused on exploitation, too quick to fear diversity, too willing to sacrifice individuals for perceived progress. And now, Zara turned to face him, fully, her dark eyes reflecting the soft glow of their holographic display. "Now I've seen what humans can accomplish when they choose cooperation over conquest. I've watched you defend someone you barely knew against institutional prejudice. I've experienced genuine partnership, real collaboration between species. But I've also seen that we represent a tiny minority." Director Walsh talks about unlimited resources and dedicated facilities, but what he really wants is to militarize our technology. "Mrs. Henderson still files weekly reports questioning my mental stability. Half the students in our program still won't work with me because they find my appearance disturbing." Marcus moved closer, close enough to see the silver flecks in her dark eyes, close enough to smell the ozonan flower's scent that had become as familiar as his own breathing. "So what's the solution?" he asked. "Wait another century and hope humanity grows up, or—" Zara's voice dropped to a whisper, "or recommend limited contact, cultural exchange programs, shared research initiatives, gradual integration instead of formal invitation to the cooperative." "That could work," Marcus said, though part of him wondered if gradual exposure might just give humanity's worst impulses more time to organize resistance. "It could," Zara agreed, "but it would mean staying here, remaining as a permanent liaison instead of returning to Zephyr for reassignment." The words hung between them, like a bridge spanning an impossible distance. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he processed the implications of what she was suggesting. "Staying here," he repeated slowly, "with me, if you'd want that." Zara's voice held a note of uncertainty that seemed almost impossible coming from someone who'd mastered interstellar travel. "I know it would complicate things. A relationship between species isn't exactly conventional, and there would be political implications." Marcus silenced her with a kiss, gentle but decisive, his hands framing her face as he poured months of suppressed longing and desperate hope into the contact. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Zara Valeneth," he said softly, "you've already turned my world upside down in the best possible way. A little more complication isn't going to scare me off." Her smile was radiant, transforming her entire face with joy that